Eric Jackson, Director of Horticulture here at Old Salem, and I'm here with Ben, and we're going to talk a little bit about the trees in Salem and here in the historic district.
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually at the Bloom House, and the Bloom House was built in 1815. We're on the back porch. It's just a beautiful spring day. Everything's budding out, and the birds are chirping. And so the joinery is actually inside of the house, and I'm a joiner and an education coordinator. So we're going to jump in there for a while. We're going to talk about the different species of trees, and we're going to talk about how those species are used in woodworking as well. So I think we'll jump into that, and then a little bit later we're going to be taking questions. So think about what you'd like to ask us, and we'll be back on in just a few minutes. Good morning, folks, and thank you so much for being with us today. So my name is Ben, and I'm an education coordinator and a joiner here at Old Salem Museum and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. And today, we're in the joiner shop here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
And we missed the gator going by.
The original part of town, Salem, that dates back to 1766. What I do here in the shop is I make a lot of reproductions that go back into the museum. So we've got this amazing wealth of old furniture, and I make copies of that, and then when people come through, we try to have as immersive an experience as we possibly can for them. They can actually use the things that we build. But we also do restoration on the buildings too, windows and shutters and doors. And so today I kind of want to talk about the legacy and the stewardship and the preservation of Salem. And so I want to talk about the trees that we use, the different types of woods that we use, and I want to talk a little bit about the history of forestry here in the Wachovia Tract as well. And the Wachovia Tract is a 100,000-acre tract that was settled by the Moravians and bought from Lord Granville of England. But the guy who first surveyed that is a guy by the name of Gottlieb Reuter. And Reuter was from Germany, comes here in the 1750s, and he goes out and explores and documents and maps this entire 100,000 acres. And he's such an appreciator of the natural environment that he writes all these wonderful passages about it and then documents all the flora and fauna that he comes across. So talking about the topography and the species, it's really amazing stuff. And we'll give you a link so you can look at it yourselves. I think the first thing we'll do is we'll just take a look at some of the species that we use. And if we're talking about the 18th century, really black walnut is king. So I'm going to pull out some black walnut here. I've got some scraps laying around. A lot of the furniture that the Moravians are building in the 18th century still is a kind of a holdover of Baroque furniture. And so that dark color and black walnut was really popular in Baroque furniture as well. And there are 7 large stands of black walnut here in this area. And we still have some of those original forests. In fact, if you go over to an earlier Moravian town called Bethania, not far from here, there's something called the Black Walnut Bottom. And you can walk along Muddy Creek and you can see a lot of these old forests. So black walnut just has this really beautiful, rich hue, and that's why we prize it. You can see here, this is just a cross section of the tree with the bark, and then the sapwood, and then the heartwood. And the heartwood is really what we are going after. And so this time of the year, the spring, these trees are waking back up again. So they're coming out of their dormant stage. And so they're bringing up the nutrients and the sap up through this layer. And the heart is really dead wood. It's there, it's growing out, it's growing up and out, but it's there to give structure to that tree. But that's what we're looking for, is that nice black heartwood. Now, the thing about black walnut is that it tends to oxidize a little bit as it gets older. So I'm going to plane a little bit and kind of expose that wood. So we've got this piece of walnut that has a lot of figure going on. Sometimes we'll actually select out wood for irregularities and this kind of idiosyncrasies in it, and you can see where we've got all kinds of weird stuff going on here and some stuff going on here too. But that means I've got to work the wood a little bit differently too. But let's start taking off some of these saw marks and getting down to that wood to see what it looks like. Now, going back to Gottlieb Reuter, he was the first forester here as well. So he's appointed as forester back to the 1750s, which is more than 100 years before Gifford Pinchot, who's really credited as the first American forester. Now, Reuter certainly wasn't the first American forester either. If we look back to the indigenous peoples of the Piedmont, Chawanok, the Waxhaw, the Tuscarora, and the Catawbas, they were all working within their environment to, for farming practices and for hunting practices and gardening. And so they were doing controlled burns, which changed the ecology of the forest as well. And those fires and that burning was actually really important to the longleaf southern yellow pine forests that were here. And we'll get back to that in just a second, but I'm gonna go ahead and plane down a little bit more black walnut. And so if I'm planing something that's so highly figured, there's probably only so much I can do with my bench planes without getting a lot of tear out. And I'm using a fairly aggressive plane right now. So a lot of times, if I'm gonna use something that's this irregular, I'm gonna have to coax it out. I could be planing kind of diagonal to the grain, and I'm following all those little undulations within the wood. But a lot of times too, this wood isn't very stable. So what we might do is just cut a thin slice of it and apply it over another piece of furniture, like a secondary wood, and use it as a veneer. And if you really cannot coax out the grain or coax out the figure without tearing it out, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll use something called a toothing plane. And the toothing plane is actually serrated, and it's more of a scraper. And so as I'm running that serrated blade across, it's leaving all these small scratches. And it's taking the wood down flat. And what I'll do after that is I'll come back with a scraping card, and I can scrape it to get a nice flat surface. So here I have a really good example of one of those 18th century black walnut chairs that was made by the Moravians. And you can see that Baroque style that I was talking about. So that guy's almost entirely black walnut, except for these rails here, which are oak. They're white oak that are slid into it. And those rails actually allow for expansion and contraction. But I want to get back to Reuter for just a second again. So what he was doing was going out into the woods, and he was allocating different trees for different uses. So Reuter actually had a stamp or a mark where he would mark the trees for how they should be used. So a really twisty tree might be used for firewood, or it might be used for the tanneries. And so oak was the primary tree that was harvested for the tanneries because of the tannic acid in the bark. Now, early on, there's accounts of people cutting down those oaks and just harvesting the bark and letting it rot there. And they're really trying to protect against that. And there's this wonderful 18th century account of somebody visiting Salem. And as they come into town, they remark on how beautiful and pastoral it is. Because usually, in the early colonies, when you build a town, you kind of harvest all of the trees around it. And it has this kind of barren landscape. But here in Salem, they were preserving trees not just for the longevity of it and for the benefit of the ecosystem. They were also maintaining some of those trees simply for the livability and the aesthetic of it. And so that's something we do today here in Salem, is we really try to preserve this beautiful setting and this delicate ecosystem. In a little while, we're going to join up with the director of horticulture here at Old Salem, and his name is Eric Jackson, and he's going to tell us about the arboretum that we have and how he stewards the trees in our district. If we look at the majority of fine cabinetry and fine furniture in the 18th century, it's going to be made out of mahogany. And mahogany really is a beautiful wood. You can see I've got this piece here that's fairly oxidized, but I've taken a couple swipes with the plane to expose it. We've got that deep red luster. It reflects the light just in this amazingly beautiful way. But there is a huge environmental and human toll to harvest that mahogany. And actually all the mahogany during that time is coming out of the Caribbean. And originally it's coming out of Jamaica. And Jamaica was renowned for the best quality of mahogany, but they harvested it right to the point of pretty much wiping it off that island. And then they moved down to cultivating sugar. And so all this stuff is being harvested and sold on the backs of enslaved people, on enslaved labor. So after Jamaica, they move into Belize. And by the 1770s, the population in Belize is 6 enslaved people to 1 European. And they're basically living in these makeshift huts. And what they have to do is they have to track these mahoganies down through the forest. And a mahogany, a huge mahogany, needs a lot of space. So it doesn't grow in a mahogany grove or forest. They might grow a mile apart from one another. So one person, they were called the huntsman, and what they would do is they would go out and they would climb trees and they would spot these mahoganies, and then there was another enslaved person that would come through, or a couple, and they would make a trail to it. They would cut it down with an axe, and they would physically drag it by hand back out and put it into these harbors and these rivers, and then float it off to the ships. A lot of times, the enslaved laborers who were harvesting those trees were also hewing them into square timbers so they could be packed in the hold of the ship more efficiently. Here in the Wachovia tract, we had sawmills as early as the 1750s over in Bethabra, which is an early Moravian town. And it was a combination mill. It was a grist mill and a sawmill. But it's interesting because when we look at a lot of this wood, we see that it's been hewn, we see that it's been pit sawn, and pit saw is basically, 2 men operating one saw, one person either down in a hole or up on a scaffold, and they're ripping through that material. And so we can see all those telltale signs. This is a timber that was taken out of St. Philip's Church. You can see the telltale marks of it being hewn. The Moravians are also working within their ecosystem to use water power, and so they're creating these races where they can divert the water off and narrow it down to speed it up and create more pressure to turn that water wheel to crank this sash saw, this vertical sash saw, and sometimes even a gang saw, which is multiple sash saws going up and down to cut out the wood. I've got one piece of wood here that we ripped out ourselves using a 2-man pit saw. And so you can see where the cuts kind of are going back and forth. They're a bit irregular. And so we could differentiate the cut of this tree versus one that's cut on a sash saw mill because it would be more consistent, more straight up and down. Now, the other woods that we would consider to be secondary woods, the woods that are going to be on the backs of furniture, the undersides of furniture, making up the insides of the drawer, around here would typically be tulip poplar and pine. But pine is oftentimes used for architectural things too, like window sash and doors. And a lot of us now think, well, pine wouldn't really hold up in the elements very well at all. It's not very rot resistant. But when we're talking about this old growth longleaf southern yellow pine, it was amazingly rot resistant. So if we look at this piece here, we can see that it was a really old tree. I don't have the whole cross section, so we couldn't necessarily count all of the rings. But here's the heart of it. That's that nice dark heart. And then as we get out to the outside, there's the sapwood on this guy. So the sapwood is the living part of that tree. That's the conduit of the sap and of the nutrients being pulled up into that tree. And the dead wood here, the heartwood, is basically just the structure of the tree. So it continues to grow and be layered upon, but it really is just there to support that tree. You can see that this particular tree, this longleaf pine, is really, really very hardy. But as you get off into that sapwood, it's softer and it's not nearly as resilient. So you can see where powder post beetles have gotten into that part of it. But also as we look from the center, and the very center of that tree would be called the pith. And as we start to look out radially into that tree, you can see that it's gone through a lot of different things within its life. Here it was growing fairly quickly, and then it slowed way down for several years. The lighter wood in between the dark rings is the spring growth. So that's what's happening right now, is that the tree is growing really fast. And because it's growing so fast, that wood is a little bit softer. And then we get into the dark rings, and they're really hard, and that's where it's slowing down in the late part of the summer, getting ready to go dormant again. But we could count every one of those dark rings and age that tree. So it's gone through some really fast growth here in this part of its life, and then slowed down a little bit again, and then it's really slowing down. And as you get out to the outside, that tree is maturing and it's getting to the end of its life, so those rings get really close together. The longleaf southern yellow pine really needs fire as part of its ecosystem and to really, stimulate its growth and perpetuate its species. And pre-colonial times, we would have had probably 90 million acres of southern yellow pines extending from, I should say longleaf southern yellow pines, extending from Florida all the way up until Virginia. And today we probably only have about 5% of that. And like I say, it's definitely, when people think of all the beautiful woods in the world, they might not think of pine as their favorite one, but it really is one of my favorites. And I love to build with it. And these old growth pieces smell so good, they're so dense. But you can see here where we've got these really heavy pitch pockets. And so there was a pine beetle infestation, but that's not really what wiped out the longleaf pine. It was really over-harvesting it. And it was being harvested for turpentine. So at first what they would do is they would scar the bark, and then it would kind of get these blisters, and that would fill up with pitch. And they would render out the pitch and use that to make turpentine. And after that tree was really depleted, then what they would do is they'd cut it down. They would use that really pitchy heartwood, and it's basically that dead wood has kind of been replaced with pitch and rosins and proteins. And they put that into a kiln, almost like charcoal, and they're really extracting the pitch out of it by heating it up and burning it down. And that's made into rosin and then pine tar. And most of that stuff is being used as what we call naval stores. It's being used for ships and things like that. Some of the early European colonists had learned that tradition of using fire to suppress the underbrush and turn a lot of this land into arable land. But now, we really look at fire suppression as a way of maintaining a forest, and really suppressing natural fires or controlled fires has also led to the demise of the longleaf southern yellow pine. Now, when I'm doing restoration work, a lot of times I try to use the same species if I can, and we'll get reclaimed pine, or actually, I should say river reclaimed pine from the rivers around here. So as it was being floated up and down the rivers going off to the mill, the really dense ones would sink to the bottom. And so people will pull those up and mill them. And we still use that. And sometimes I get lucky. I can pick through piles of lumber and find not necessarily old growth, but something we call a slow growth. So instead of like a plantation grown tree, this one probably was harvested from the wild. So we know that the wood is always going to move around. But we can kind of minimize some of that movement. And if I'm doing something like a restoration project, like a window, and I need to make those really delicate muntins, then I need to get something that's quarter sawn, both for the workability of it, but also for the stability of it. And that's something that is really interesting about wood, is that it's very comfortable, very malleable thing to work with, but it's always swelling and it's always shrinking. And sometimes it can cup and sometimes it can warp. So you're thinking about how to mitigate that the best you can. And if we look at this piece here, you can see that the piece has been cut out. Okay, if we look at the way those growth rings are going in a circle, this guy's basically being taken right across, kind of perpendicular to those growth rings. And so we've got the growth rings going straight across it. So we call that quarter sawn. You're quartering out the wood, which is a more expensive wood because you're wasting the wood in between it. But it gives a really, it's a very stable cut and also a very workable cut. So a quarter sawn piece of wood is probably about the most uniform piece of wood I can work with, and it's going to work very easily, as it'll be very predictable. But like I was saying earlier, sometimes you're selecting wood out for all of these idiosyncrasies within the grain, and sometimes you'll have these anomalies that make it so beautiful, but also make it very difficult to work with. And with this particular piece here, this is maple, and this is a type of wood that Reuter definitely talks about in his survey. And he says that maple is really good on the lathe, and it is. It's a very closed cell grain, whereas something like oak has very wide open grain, and it just doesn't tool nearly as nicely. But this particular piece is what we call bird's eye maple, and you definitely see it in cabinet making and furniture, but you really see this in violins, stringed instruments, and guns as well. And they call it bird's eye because it literally looks like it's got all of these little eyes all over it. And so that's one defect, I guess you could say, that gives a figure. Another one is quilting. And I don't know if we can really spot it when we look at this piece because it's got a lot of oxidization on it. But this one has all kinds of figure. And there's a lot of speculation as to what causes the figure, but the truth of the matter is we don't really know, and we can't replicate it. It's probably a genetic anomaly. And so you can see where that grain has this real quilted type look to it. You can see here where it's probably been run through a modern planer and it's chipped and it's torn out. But if I work that down, it's going to reflect and refract the light in this really wavy form to make it super beautiful. I'm going to pick up an instrument that I've been working on, a violin, and show you. A lot of times flamed maple is called fiddleback maple because it's the preferred wood and has been since the 17th century for the backs of violins. So here we've got maple as well, and we can see this flaming. Some people call it tiger stripe, like I say, fiddleback. And when I'm working with this, what I have to do is, the final thing I'll do is I scrape it. We don't sand it because the sanding actually dulls the grain, and that's not what they would have done in the 17th and 18th and even early 19th century. So when I scrape it, I have to scrape across the grain and with the figure. Otherwise what happens is I actually get a washboard effect. Now that's probably quartered out, and it's preferable to have quarter sawn wood for instruments because it's much more stable. But if you look here, what you're seeing, this is also maple, and it could very well be sawn from the same piece of wood as the back. But we're looking at a different side of it, and so we're seeing what's called medullary rays. And so the medullary rays are kind of going from the pith towards the outside of the tree. So when we quarter it out and we look at that face, we see all of these cellular pathways that are going from the center outwards. And that's what gives all those cool little flecks in there. And when I finally put the varnish on it, all of that figure really pops. That's when you really see it. So the oldest American-made violin was actually made by a Moravian named John Antes. And John was an instrument builder and a cabinet maker, but he was also a composer of classical music. And the Moravians have this amazing wealth of sacred and classical music. And for me, kind of the most intimate form of woodworking is instrument building. And I play some music myself as well, but it's so delicate. It's almost like you're building this living, breathing thing. And you're working with wood that, even after we've harvested it, really is a living, breathing thing. It's going to move and it's going to react. And the most amazing thing about building a musical instrument, especially a violin, is that when you first string it up, you get it varnished and string it up and you play it, it really still thinks it's a tree. It doesn't quite know that it's a musical instrument yet. So you need to put a lot of time and a lot of music into it before the whole thing becomes much more flexible and it starts to respond to the player. And each player really puts a different musical imprint on the instrument. So this isn't necessarily quite as popular during the colonial times, although you definitely see some quartered out English furniture made of oak that shows this grain pattern. But I think a lot of us think about quarter sawn oak in arts and crafts furniture. And so you can see these really wonderful little streaks within the grain. And that's because we've got quarter sawn, and we're looking at that face. So we're looking at those cellular pathways coming from the center going out, and we're looking at a cross-section of them, and that's what creates the quarter sawn fleck that we're used to in that kind of furniture. Otherwise, if it was slab sawn, and basically slab sawn is where you're just taking the tree down as it lays on the sawmill, you're taking off those round rings. And what slab sawn looks like would be more like this black walnut here, where the growth rings are kind of laying down flat. So let's start taking off the oxidization and get down to the flame of that maple. And I'm actually planing diagonal to the grain and almost perpendicular to it sometimes. I'm taking pretty small cuts so I don't tear it out. And you can see how the light is starting to be reflected on that figure. So you've got this really three-dimensional look to it. Well, I've taken off some of the heavier oxidization, so I'm going to come back with my toothing plane. I'm going to start to tooth that down. Just to get it flat. I'm going to come back with my scraper, and it's just a piece of tool steel, and I've rolled over the edge so it's got a little bit of a hook, a little cut to it that way. And I'm going to start to scrape off all the serrations I've made with that toothing plane. So we're starting to get right down to almost a finished edge or a finished surface. And you can see how beautiful that figured grain is. So a piece of wood like this is definitely going to require a lot more finesse and a lot more trickery to kind of coax out that beautiful grain. But that's one of the wonderful things about working with wood, is that you really are just working with this amazing resource to try to bring out the most beautiful aspect of it that you can turn into your own artistry. So even before we put a finish on it, we can see like how intense that figure is and how beautiful that wood is. But the varnish is really going to bring that out. I'm just going to use a really simple mixture here of turpentine, so that's that solvent that is rendered from the Longleaf southern yellow pine, and I'm using that to cut linseed oil, which is derived from pressing flaxseed. And when I put that in, it's going to soak into the wood, it's going to soak in nice and deep, and then it really accentuates that wave within the grain, that figure within the grain. So I'm not adding any color aside from what's in that varnish. And for every cabinet maker and every shop, there's a lot of different kind of secret recipes of varnish. But anyways, this is just a real simple varnish of linseed oil and turpentine. Now there are definitely some woods that turn on the lathe much more easily than others. And right now I've got a piece of maple up here, and maple's a really good turning wood. And we mill up a lot of our own lumber and we air dry it. And the rule of thumb is that for every inch of thickness on a piece of wood, it takes about a year to air dry it. But sometimes actually what we'll do is we'll split the piece out of a green tree, and we split it into quarters, and we can turn it green. And if it's quarter split, like we talked about earlier, it's much more stable, and so you don't get as much shrinking when it does dry. But oftentimes if you look at old furniture and you feel like a chair leg or a table leg, it'll be egg-shaped, and what that indicates is that it probably was turned when it was still green. And when it's green, it's got a higher moisture content, and it's simply just easier because it's softer. But this is a dried piece of maple, and I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of turning. And it's just such a wonderful experience to use your entire body and use your eye and your creativity and really try to come up with something very artistic and be as masterful and as patient as you can. Something I really appreciate about turning on the spring pole or foot-driven lathe versus on an electric lathe is just how slow it goes and how much you're thinking about the piece as you're working on it, and how much attention you're paying to your tools as well. Because at this slow rate, your tool really has to be a lot sharper than if I was spinning this guy at 1,800 revolutions a minute. So one of the most special things about being part of a living history museum like Old Salem It's not that we're trying to mine for nostalgia or we're trying to reenact history, but more that we're a continuation of this heritage of conservation and sustainability, and really, really appreciating the resources that we're working with. So let's join up with Eric Jackson and take a look at how he employs that sustainability in working with the outside environment here at Old Salem as well.
Thank you guys. We're back now with Ben and Eric. We had some great questions. I'm trying to not talk too much because I'm not sure if you can hear me okay, so they're going to help me by restating some of the questions we had here. But the first one we got is about sourcing wood. So Ben, I think this is for you. Can you talk about the difficulty of sourcing wood for your projects around here?
Yeah.
And do you do repairs here for wooden antiques on the property?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the question is, how do we source the wood, and is it difficult to source the wood? And then do we also do restoration and work on some of the antiques here? And the answer is yes, it definitely can be hard to source wood of the quality that would have been used in the 18th and early 19th century. I think part of it is, just finding things that have the density and the tight growth rings that we see back then. But it's especially hard when we're doing architectural restoration, because a lot of that was, southern yellow pine, and we just don't have that quality of pine anymore. So if you went off to Lowe's or Home Depot, you have these really wide growth rings, and it tends to rot and distort pretty quickly. So the other thing is just simply the width of the boards that we see on a lot of that old furniture. Sometimes we'll see a table that's 2 planks. So to find 2 black walnut planks that are, close to 24 inches wide is really super difficult. But what I will say is that we actually have our own sawmill here. It's an electric sawmill, so it actually leaves the same kind of marks as what a water-powered saw would leave in the 18th century. And a lot of people donate wood to us. So like here in the district or in the community, if somebody has a tree that's taken down, then they'll let us know oftentimes, and we salvage that tree, or we just get a hold of arborists and we say, hey, we're looking for a white oak, we're looking for a black walnut. So a lot of what we use is scavenged wood. So great question, thank you, I appreciate that one.
Thanks, Ben. And before we dive into a few of the other questions we got, I want to give Eric Jackson a chance to introduce himself, talk a little bit about what it's like working here at Old Salem, stewarding these trees, the arboretum that he takes care of, and I see he has some things to show us as well. So Eric, do you want to take it away?
Sure. So here in Old Salem, we have about 33 acres of property that we maintain as a landscape. And we have a few areas that we sort of treat as like arboretums. One's right behind us on the other side of Salt Street. And there's maybe 25 different species of trees down there. I think I was looking, we have about 59 different species of native trees here in the district all around total. Some also down below Mesda, and then a little bit to the north side of the district as well. There's some spaces. So we just try to take care of them the best we can, identify them. We did a big tree inventory last summer. We try to remove invasive species that are coming up around. The English ivy is a big problem. Just trying to keep the trees healthy and happy, and just try to appreciate and educate about them. I brought a few things I can just show what I brought. So Ben was talking about the pines, the 2 types of southern yellow pine. We were talking off camera earlier that southern yellow pine is sort of a broad blanket statement for pines in the south, really, and the 2 types of pines that are native to Forsyth County and the Wachovia Tract and here in Salem are the shortleaf pine, which is this one, and then also I have the Virginia pine, and ironically the shortleaf pine has longer leaves than the needles than the scrub pine. So this is Pinus echinata, and this is Pinus virginiana. So these are our 2 pines here in the district. And then I brought some other leaves I just quickly gathered. We've got the cherry bark oak. We have a lot of different oaks. There's cherry bark, there's the scarlet oak, there's the white oak, there's the chestnut oak, which is off camera, not far away. It's my favorite tree. here in the district. I think, or one of my favorite trees is the chestnut oak. Ben mentioned earlier the water race and the water mill. Reuter mentioned that the chestnut oak was used for the axle of the water mills. So that's kind of a neat thing. Other trees that I've got some just leaves of, this is the chestnut, or sorry, this is Chinese chestnut, and historically about 25% of the hardwoods here would have been chestnut, but they are gone because of the chestnut blight. So we've planted a Chinese chestnut just as a reminder, and to have a chestnut species here in the district. But we're facing quite a few right now. We in a similar, the pines have pine beetles as a problem, and then the elms. We have a great big elm here actually, but the elms were wiped out a while ago, and now our ashes, we have the ash borers are currently getting into our ash trees, so we're looking to lose our ash trees here in the next decade or so. But yeah, that's the main thing. I'll show the just the red maple little seedlings there. There you can see it back behind us.
It's such a beautiful tree.
Yeah.
And Eric, you're someone who's in a long line of people who've been taking care of the landscape here at Old Salem. Can you talk about historically how Old Salem as a site has been doing this for so many years?
Sure. Started back in the early 70s. Flora Bynum was really the impetus, and she did a lot of the early research and met with people in the community and sourced trees to plant and shrubs and everything, and figure out how the garden should be and what they should look like. And she was a huge advocate that the historic buildings needed a landscape that was appropriate to give them context, and not just mowed golf course, grass around. And so a lot of the early research and the early plantings, and really all of our plantings, really go back to the Reuters list that Ben mentioned earlier. They're all native trees and shrubs for the most part. We've got some colonial species, and they're usually the fruiting, apples and peaches, and we have a medlar, we have some other weird things. But Flora Bynum was really the start, and she was largely responsible for this area, Arboretum area behind us and down, that early 70s they planted, and also in the later 70s. Then Peter Hatch, who went on to Monticello for many years, they planted a lot of things around the district. And then in 89, the big tornado came through in May of 89 and took out a lot of trees. So there was a big planting effort after that to replace a lot of trees. And then in 99, about 10 years after that, I know there was another effort to plant. So all around the district have been, this sort of a continual effort to replant and maintain native trees. And then, we still do that today. Every year we try to plant some trees or shrubs and things. So it's pretty unique for an urban environment to have this many native trees. Often it will just be more invasive trees of heaven or privet, and we have some of those things here, but we try to remove them if we can.
Well, speaking of 1989, can you talk a little bit about Salem Pathways and what we're doing with Flora Bynum?
Yeah, so very soon the Salem Pathways is going to, April 1st, Salem Pathways is going to launch, and one of the things we've been doing with some of the trees physically is we get the mulch and we're making pathways, but then you can also use the road, but it's going to be a smartphone, self-guided tour of all around Salem, telling the stories of a lot of different people who aren't necessarily tied to buildings, but Floram's going to be one of the characters. There'll be a lot of different historic figures through time, and we're really excited about it. I'm really excited to experience it. I'm also excited to really get Flora Ann's story out there as part of that. So I think it's going to add a layer of depth to the landscape and understanding, and
Thanks, Eric.
pretty
And I
excited.
have one more question for you, and then we'll
Yeah.
get you off the spot and we'll ask a few of Ben. But I know that we have a long tradition here at Old Salem of stewarding the landscape, but just because we're so embedded in that tradition and that stewardship and that history doesn't mean that we can't always rethink and kind of change the way that we do that. I know you're working on a new landscape and garden plan. Do you want to talk briefly about what your process has been behind establishing this new plan and kind of the thoughts that we've been having about our landscapes?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it's sort of building off of what's already been here, and a lot of it's based on even just reassessing what do we have here again. Just there, just doing an inventory, and then a lot of trees have died and things have been planted over the time. So just sort of updating that, and then also rethinking a lot of it is sort of based on what the landscape the Moravians encountered when they first came to this land, but this was before the Moravians took over this land. It was the native peoples and Native Americans of this place. So just thinking about that and that much longer, history of people on the landscape, and then in their cultural relationship with the plants that were here. And we like to try to acknowledge that, and then also learn about that and try to promote that as well, and not just specifically about the Moravians, and just steward the native plants that are here. I think that's the very least that we can do, that we now have the burden of stewardship of this land. So for the moment, we need to take care of the native plants that are here. And there's a huge ecological purpose for that as well, looking forward, just looking at climate crisis and extinction crisis and that sort of thing. So really the native plants are tools to help combat that. So
Absolutely. I have a quick question for you too, Eric. So when it comes to the cultivated gardens, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the Homoa seed collection that you have as well.
Yeah, so part of in the gardens we save a lot of heirloom plants, and we have a seed collection based on all the old varieties that we can find. We have at least in the seed fridge, if not growing in the gardens at one time or another. But the Homoa harvest collection was put together maybe in 2012, and it's just basically acknowledging the African American genetic legacy that we have here. So just the crops that came from Africa and also culturally used by African Americans here, but crops from Africa being like sorghum and okra and watermelon and cowpeas, and then other just not necessarily from Africa, but ones that we could tell had a cultural relationship. Some of the peppers and herbs and lots of varieties, and we consulted with Michael Twitty with that. So yeah, that's just part of the
it's an amazing thing that you have.
Seed collection. And then along those same lines, a lot of the seed collections also has the Native American ancestry of just the corns and the beans and the squash, and many of the early crops that especially in Bethabara, that the Moravians would have subsided on were corn and squash and pumpkins and beans. And
Definitely, that's really neat. So there's just like a ton of cultural crossover, and there's a lot of learning especially from Indigenous people when they get here.
Yeah.
Something you were telling me about too is some of the Indigenous uses of trees. Like, one of my favorite trees to use in the trade of cabinetry is black walnut, just because it's simply beautiful.
Yeah.
But it has a lot more uses than just being a pretty wood. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's a food plant. So the oaks as well, the acorns, especially the white oak, are low in tannins and are sweeter oaks, and that was a food. So the black walnut. Plus, I think it had medicinal uses. It could be used as the dye. So many of the tulip poplars are good canoes.
Right.
That sort of thing. I think the Moravians adopted that practice as well and probably made canoes out of some of the early tulip poplars.
Oh, that's really cool. We were talking about maple syrup a little bit earlier, and were Indigenous people harvesting maple syrup here as well?
That's a good question. I
Yeah,
don't know the answer to.
I'm not sure either.
I know Reuter mentions that early on, the Moravians here did harvest from the sugar maples that are here and from the red maple that is here behind us. They tapped that and would use that, get the sweet water from there, and then also they tapped the white oaks, and we get like a vinegar from the white oaks they would put on their salads.
I remember reading that as well, and I suppose that just has to do with all the tannic acid in the oak tree.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. What was I going to ask you? So, could we still? I think when we were talking about like the 18th century, it was considerably colder. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, there was a little mini ice age at one point.
So is that more conducive to tapping the trees and making maple syrup?
I think so.
Yeah, I think it probably is too.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
Well, speaking of methods that both the Moravians and Indigenous people use to control burns, like you were talking about, Ben, and other ways that they kind of manipulated their environment through different technologies. Do you know if the Moravians or if any Indigenous peoples of this region used any natural methods for pest control or any other things that we maybe use chemicals for nowadays, but was done in a different way in the colonial period?
That sounds like an Eric question to me.
So the question was, if you can't spend is what sort of natural pest controls and methods. There's a lot of old. I think yes. I don't have a quick answer for that. There's a lot of things. I mean, I know willow was used to help propagate. Willow water is often used to help propagate plants. A lot of the ashes and things that would be used for fertilizer and amendments would help, especially for phosphorus in the soil, and that, good healthy soil is the first step towards disease resistance and pest resistance. So they would have definitely done that.
What about crop rotation?
The Moravians, I think from what I was reading, they did practice crop rotation before they got down here, but the soil was so fertile down here that they didn't really need to rotate crops. So I think they actually sort of abandoned that crop rotation practice when they came down to Wachovia.
Yeah. I remember around our cabin that we lived in, my wife Hillary planted a lot of tansy. She said that would keep mosquitoes and some flies away too. Have you heard that as well?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have.
We were talking going back to the black walnut and talking about pesticides and herbicides, natural herbicides.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you're talking about juglone.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that again.
Yeah, juglone is a substance that the walnuts secrete from their roots it sort of inhibits competition around them, and a lot of plants, not all plants, but many plants, it's toxic to them, so they won't grow. I know tomatoes are famously really sensitive to juglone, so you can't grow tomatoes underneath a walnut tree. But yeah, and that could have been, those are the types that, who knows what, that could probably be utilized as a natural herbicide of some sort.
Could be harnessed somehow, maybe. Yeah.
Not sure if it was or not. But
yeah, that's the thing. We were talking about the historic gardens behind the doctor's house, and it's so beautiful. If you haven't been there, please come and check it out, because it's terraced, and it would have been terraced for, I think there's probably an elevation of, I don't know, 40, 50 feet, maybe more? Probably a lot
it's
more.
Steep. Yeah, it's pretty steep. I don't know what the grade is, but it's steep.
It's really steep, and historically there were gardens and vineyards back there. And we'd like to do it again, but there are these massive, beautiful black walnuts back there, so we're just going to revere those and appreciate those for the time being.
We're getting some really good questions.
Great, yeah, let's hear the questions.
Okay, so we're used to seeing living history, colonial sites being super neat and tidy with perfect boxwoods, etc. Can you talk about the difference between a colonial revival landscape, so maybe like how colonial landscapes were imagined when these historic sites were created, versus what a true colonial landscape may have looked like?
Do you want to take that one, Eric?
I could say that, I think there was a time in the early mid 1900s when a lot of historic sites were coming on, and just what Samantha said. Well, I guess I'll repeat the question just in case the people were asking about colonial revival landscapes versus what we can best suppose a true landscape from a colonial era might have looked like. And colonial revival, I think, was very based in like what people imagined. It was like with a very neat and orderly component sort of superimposed that probably wasn't here. I mean, I think the Moravians were somewhat orderly, and they definitely planted, back to trees like alleys. There was a lot of alley planting along roads, and Cedar Alley by God's Acres is a good example, and they also did that with the sycamores here in Salem. But I think it was also pretty wild. They let the animals, like the cattle and the pigs, were, at least in the forested areas, were
allowed to forage and run free. And
I think it was pretty muddy. I
bet the streets were fairly muddy. I would imagine. But too, and maybe we could pop some links in here. There's some amazing landscape paintings of Salem in the 18th and early 19th century, like Daniel Welfare. Whenever I'm thinking about how to kind of visualize Salem during that time period, I pull up a whole bunch of Daniel Welfare paintings. Because you can get all these different vantage points. You can get like all these different elevations. And there's much earlier paintings than his as well that really show the way everything was laid out. And part of the landscape too was the fencing. There was just like a ton of fencing, split rail fences, and having split some rails, I can't imagine all the labor that went into that sort of infrastructure as well. That's something that Reuter talks about in his survey, is like what trees were used for, what they're good for, and he talks about the straightest, best trees being allocated for building and fence rails and for bolts, and then the squirrely stuff was usually used for like tanning bark or firewood. And just imagine too, like if you're cooking with wood, if you're heating with wood, it was a tremendous amount of wood that was being consumed here. But we should, too bad we didn't have Tara with us. Tara can talk about the efficiency of these ceramic wood-burning tile stoves here in the Wachovia that the Moravians kind of introduced to this area. So it's not like those old cast iron Franklin stoves. It's much more efficient than that, but still it was a lot of consumption for sure.
Definitely, and I think one other thing to add, and this is my Pythagoras bias showing, but there definitely was a lot of influence with European gardening, especially English gardens. I know the Hortus Medicus at Pythagoras was it's almost medieval garden.
It is.
I guess that's the cool thing about this area is that it's really a blend of all these different traditions, and the way that they use the land is also going to affect how the land then looks, depending on its use. It's a really interesting question. Yeah,
there was something when I was reading through the Reuter bit, he was talking about intentionally not harvesting certain trees. So that was a big contrast, but also being really mindful of the watershed. That really impressed me.
Yes, where they wouldn't let the offsayer collegium wouldn't allow them to harvest trees around the springs, and
they couldn't fell a tree in a creek. Very like and these early foresters weren't necessarily scientists. I think they were probably more laymen, but they had some expertise. But they weren't necessarily biologists,
I got some just quick ones for you.
Good.
Do you guys know how old that big poplar tree on the square is?
How old is that massive poplar up on the square? They're really fast growing, so they can get pretty massive in a short amount of time. I guess that one would have survived the tornado that Eric was talking about. And I think there was a whole bunch of those old trees up there, but if I were to guess, I'd say, because they are so fast growing, 100 years old? What do you think?
That was going to be my guess, something like that.
Someday when it's succumbed to age, we can count the growth rings and get back to you on that one.
See how close you were.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, and what is the difference between natural or air-dried wood versus a kiln-dried material? I know you talked about that, Ben, but is there a difference in how they work?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. I mean, sometimes I have to hold back from getting too nerdy, so I really appreciate that question. But air-dried wood for us is just so much more workable. And you can kiln dry a piece of wood to make it a pretty decent, usable piece of wood. But what happens oftentimes is that you cook it so hot that the steam and the water just have to escape so quickly that it actually damages the wood and it blows up the cellular structure inside. So what I run into when I'm working with kiln-dried wood oftentimes is that when you're planing it, it's what we call brash, meaning it doesn't work very well under the plane. It tears and it chips, and it just doesn't roll off in these nice shavings. The other thing too is if you cook it that fast, it's going to dry on the outside much faster than it dries on the inside. So when you start busting into it and you get that outside layer off, all of a sudden it starts to twist and distort, and it's not a stable wood. So air dried for us is more predictable. It's probably going to move more than kiln dried wood as far as expansion and contraction, but it's more predictable in that. So that's a challenge, is that if you need to have a supply of air dried wood, you got to have these stickered piles of lumber, and they're they're pretty awkward. They're pretty hard to store, but you can store them outside as well.
Also start early.
Start early, yes. Be planning.
How do you tell what kind of tree your furniture is made from?
It's just the characteristic of the grain, and its grain pattern. It's the way it reflects the wood. It's all these little pores. I don't really have anything out here right now. Each one I'm trying to think of what I could, okay, I think it's a little bit like if somebody were to ask me to differentiate between a bunch of different wines, I'd be clueless. I wouldn't, you start talking about tannins and oak overtones, I really wouldn't know. But when you start looking at wood, they have all these characteristics that become real obvious after a while. And some are really obvious, like tulip poplar and maple are just white. And then black walnut is obviously really dark, and mahogany is really deep and dark. But you and I might have to talk more about the specific identification of your furniture.
Great. And what's the strangest species you've ever seen used in a piece of furniture?
Well, I mean, I think now with wood, wood's always been moved around the world. I guess that's true. But a lot of people are really into exotic woods. So if we're talking about a historical context, what's the strangest wood I've seen used in a piece of furniture? I think the most interesting wood I've seen used in a piece of furniture around here is this massive desk and bookcase down in Mesda that was built by Johannes Kraus, who is the master joiner of the Single Brothers joinery back in the 18th century. And he used the crotchwood of a cherry. So sometimes you'll see a tree will split off and grow into two separate directions. And what they did is they cut slices, little cross sections, veneers off. Now when we look at veneers, they're usually turned on a big lathe, and those slices of wood are turned off radially. Well, back then they would cut nearly an 1/8 inch of a slab of it. And it has all of this figure going out like this, and it's really wild. So it's not the cherry is a real exotic wood, but that particular piece of wood is just amazingly exotic looking.
Eric, I got a question for you. Does the use of moss in gardens or yards show up at all in Moravian history?
I don't know about in yards and gardens. I do know that a lot of the botanists that live here were very interested, especially Louis David von Schweinitz did a lot of lichen and moss and all those little early types of plants. As far as just cataloging and identifying those out in the wild, but I'm not sure about in a garden or in a yard.
Okay. And Ben, earlier when you were talking previously, you mentioned something about the wood looking egg-shaped if you're turning it green. What does that mean? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, definitely. So you get different shrinkage. Okay, so if you're turning it green, it just means it still has moisture. It's not been cured. It's not been air dried to a point of stable relative humidity. So it's going to shrink, but you can mitigate distortion by quartering it out. And I've got like this chunk of pine here. I'll bring it up to the camera. And so, if we took a cross section, we could get this real stable piece. But it's going to shrink differently, tangentially and radially. And so what happens is it shrinks more in one direction than it does in the other direction. So you might start off with a perfect cylinder when you get it off the lathe, but as it dries for 200 years, it's going to shrink more in one direction than the other. So you feel it, and it's oval shaped more than it is round anymore. So that's usually a telltale sign that it was turned out green.
Thank you. We'll let that ambulance go by.
Yeah.
I just had a thought of something to interject that I don't know if you want to. We were talking earlier off camera when the video was playing about mahogany and the mahogany is used in Salem.
Yeah.
And you were saying that it wasn't commonly used in furniture. In Salem.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a good point. And I realized that kind of after we had filmed that was the distinction I was getting around to, is that, you know, there was such a toll for harvesting mahogany, but it wasn't used here in Salem. Almost all the wood that was used here in Salem was domestic. And that could be reflected in the arboretum that Eric stewards here. That's what you're going to see in the furniture here, is the trees that are growing right behind us. Great point. I'm glad you brought that up.
I just thought about it at some point.
Yeah, definitely.
We've got another question here about pests, and in this case we mean bigger pests. So this person said, big pests were kept out by fences, right? So fences for every town lot. I assume they mean like wild animals.
Yeah.
And even keeping the pigs and the cattle out, I think, and you know, as much as also, I mean, there were lots of, I don't know what was necessarily here. There was lots of big, you know, there were wolves here, and Reuters account of Wachovia, the survey, is really interesting because he talks about like they dug pits to catch wolves, and the panthers that were as big as deer, and you know, there were a lot of big, I'm hesitant to call those animals pests, but definitely that. Some of our pests, you know, we have, you know, there's deer and rabbits and things and groundhogs today, but
yeah, for pests, I mean, it really was risking their livelihood. I know with the wolves, they had to be so careful. Their cattle were getting killed by the wolves.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the fences also were to protect their livestock as well, probably.
Yeah, well, and I think too, it's such an ordered town, Salem is. You know, everything is so laid out on the grid that the fences kind of delineated that orderliness. And you're right in saying that, yes, each lot was typically fenced. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
2 more questions here.
Mm-hmm.
How much of a tree is useful when you're making furniture?
How much of the tree is useful? That's a great question. Well, it all depends on how you're going about it and how you're thinking about it. You know, and for the Moravians, they're going to look at the top of that tree, the canopy, where it starts to branch off, and that's going to be firewood. That's going to be used, and Reuter talks about that early on, that people aren't utilizing enough of the tree. They're leaving those tops lay out in the woods. And like Eric and I were talking about that before, that's probably actually best for the ecology of the forest, is to leave that top out there to rot and create some habitat for the animals as well. But they're going to utilize that for firewood. But when you look, and I don't know if you can see in the frame, that first 15 feet of that tree right there, that's what we call the saw log. It's straight, it doesn't have any knots in it, and so we're going to get the best quality lumber out of that first 15, 20 feet of that tree. Now, if we want to get into some real figured stuff, like we talked about Johannes Krauss' desk and bookcase, then we can get up to where it first starts to split off. But I'm not going to use branches for furniture, and the reason we don't use branches for furniture is they're growing very unevenly to work against gravity. So they're really asymmetrical when you break into them. So if you use those guys, what happens is they're going to spring and twist and turn all over the place because they've grown to fight horizontally against gravity. So we almost never use branches. That's a really great question.
And I'm going to throw in an extra one. Eric, what are some of the trees out here?
So right here, so the tree that Ben was referring to is a pin oak, and then behind it is either a walnut or a pecan. I get them confused, they both, and they don't have leaves right now. We have a nice dogwood nearby right there. There's a red maple behind us. There's a bunch of eastern red cedar. There's a beech. That beech is another one of my favorite trees. Right there in the center of the tavern yard. It's the only beech we have some beech that are sort of out on the edges of things. It's the only beech right in Salem. There's a Magnolia grandiflora behind us. There's camellia. There's the native holly, American holly. And further on out is there's a willow oak. There's a bunch of trees back there.
And behind us, that's the arboretum, correct?
Correct. Yeah. There's about 25 different species of native trees out there. Plus, we've planted a bunch of native shrubs as well. So there's a lot of diversity out there.
Great. just have one more question. Can you talk a little bit more about what you meant when you said that the violin will change based on the player?
Sure, yeah. So the question that Samantha asked is, can I talk a little bit more about how a violin would change from the time it's built and its aging in process? Violins particularly move very violently. They're such small, very highly arched instruments, and so they vibrate. When you look at them and slow them down, it's just tremendous how much vibration is going on. So when it's brand new, there's all the stiffness to it. And we typically use hide glue even because it's more flexible than like the modern glues would be, and it resonates better as well. But there's a stiffness. Like I say, it kind of thinks it's a piece of furniture to start off with. So you're listening to it and you're tuning the plates as you're shaving them down and trying to get them to the right thickness and the right flexibility. But you've got to literally work the music into it. You've got to get that wood vibrating and opening up. And then it becomes almost, if you think of dropping a rock into the water and the way you watch the ripples out, it's the same thing with the music in a violin. It's going to ripple out throughout that wood. And the more it does that, the more that wood becomes really responsive. And so the player has a lot to do with how that instrument responds over time. And to be honest, the better the player, the better that instrument's going to sound because they can just nurture all this beautiful tone out of it. So that's kind of what I was talking about.
That's great. And we just had one more question pop up, and I think this is our last one. Were the Moravian cabinet makers being influenced by English cabinet making trends, or were they more insular and sticking to Germanic trends?
That's a really good question. And we had talked about that a little earlier. We were on TikTok Live for a while. And it's not like the Shakers where you have this highly specific type of furniture that they build. We can say that there's like characteristics in the 18th century that are very harken back to Baroque furniture and this older Germanic furniture. But honestly, the Moravians are living in a lot of different places in the world. And there's a 18th century Moravian community in London. And a lot of these folks are cabinet makers and instrument builders. And they're being totally influenced by the English cabinetry of the time as well. And somebody that I really want to mention is David Runchen. David Runchen is building some of the most, he's a Moravian in London, and he's building some of the most fanciful furniture built in the world at that time. All these secret compartments, extremely bizarre geometric shapes, veneers upon veneers, marquetry, and he's selling to the sovereigns of Europe. So to say that they just build this really humble, insular furniture would certainly not be a true representation of all the different kinds of furniture that they build.
Thank you both. I think those are all the questions. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we wrap up?
I don't think so. Get out. It's a beautiful day out. If you can get outside and enjoy it,
That's what I was going to say. Come and enjoy the Arboretum. Walk around the district. Eric's doing a beautiful job, and the gardens are coming up now. So come and walk around. And thank you so much for taking part of the day and joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you both.